When you think of a shed, the first image that likely comes to mind is a cold, damp space cluttered with forgotten garden tools and old tires. It's not exactly a place where you'd picture anyone living, let alone thriving. But for Margaret, a 72-year-old woman with a spirit as bright as her blue eyes, a shed was all she had left. Life had thrown Margaret more than a few curveballs over the years, but losing her home was the hardest hit yet. Her modest pension couldn't stretch far enough to cover rising rent and medical bills, and with no family nearby, she found herself standing in front of an old, weather-beaten shed at the edge of a friend's property, her last and only refuge. The shed was anything but welcoming. Its paint was peeling, the roof sagged with age, and inside was nothing more than bare walls and a floor littered with rusted nails and spider webs. It was damp, cramped, and bone-chillingly cold. The tiny window, smudged and cracked, let in barely enough light to chase away the shadows. For a moment, Margaret's resolve wavered. Could she really make a home out of this dark, lifeless box? But Margaret wasn't the kind to let a bit of dust and decay scare her off. With her savings nearly gone and nowhere else to turn, she knew this shed was her last chance. Armed with little more than a toolbox, a second-hand drill, and a heart full of determination, Margaret set out to make this gloomy shed her new home. At first, the task seemed impossible. The walls were rough and splintered, the floor uneven, and a bitter draft seeped in through the cracked window pane. But Margaret had faced tougher battles in her life, losing her husband to cancer, watching her children move across the country for jobs, managing on her own for years. This was just one more challenge. With her sleeves rolled up and a stubborn set to her jaw, she decided that if this was her last stand, it would be a beautiful one. The first step was clearing the clutter. Margaret dragged out old cans of paint, broken garden tools, and stacks of soggy cardboard. It took hours, then days, but slowly a vision began to take shape. The shed was tiny, barely big enough to stretch her arms out without touching the walls, but Margaret saw potential where others saw decay. She scrubbed the walls clean and sealed the gaps where the wind howled through. With every nail hammered and every wall patched, the shed started to feel a little less like a prison and a bit more like a possibility. Using every bit of her small savings and a few kind donations from neighbors, Margaret picked up a bucket of warm cream-colored paint. With each stroke of the brush, the dark wooden walls began to brighten, reflecting the little light that came through the window and making the space feel less cramped. A soft rug covered the bare floorboards, and bright curtains sewn from old sheets framed the small window, adding a touch of color. The transformation was already incredible, but Margaret was just getting started. She scavenged through yard sales and secondhand stores, finding treasures in other people's discarded things. A sturdy little table, a cozy armchair, and a lamp with a warm amber glow. Bit by bit, the shed began to feel less like a shed and more like a home. The old storage shelves were transformed into kitchen cabinets, and a simple countertop provided space for a kettle and a few mismatched mugs. Margaret even managed to fit a tiny stove into one corner, making it possible to brew tea on chilly mornings. But it wasn't just the inside that needed attention. Determined to erase the gloomy first impression, Margaret painted the outside of the shed a soft sage green, with white trim that made it look more like a storybook cottage than a rundown shack. She planted marigolds and lavender along the walkway and hung a wooden sign above the door that read "Welcome" in careful script. At night, Solar lights lined the path, casting a warm glow and turning the little shed into a beacon in the dark. The real magic, though, happened when you stepped inside. Gone were the cold, empty walls and splintered floors. In their place was a snug living space filled with color and light. A small bookshelf cradled her favorite novels, a patchwork quilt covered the bed, and a string of fairy lights twinkled above. In one corner, a radio played softly, filling the space with old jazz tunes that reminded Margaret of her late husband and the way they used to dance on Saturday nights. Every detail was a labor of love, from the handmade cushions on the chairs to the crocheted doilies on the table. Despite the modest size, every corner of the shed was filled with warmth and personality. Friends stopped by with homemade pies and jars of jam, marveling at how the old shed had become such a cozy retreat. Word spread through the town, and soon people were coming just to see Margaret's tiny palace, as they called it. They couldn't believe their eyes. And it wasn't just visitors who were impressed. Margaret herself was amazed at how much she had accomplished with so little. She had thought she was simply making a place to sleep, but what she had really built was a sanctuary, a place that wrapped her in comfort and memories. At night, tucked beneath her quilt with the fairy lights glowing softly overhead, Margaret would close her eyes and listen to the wind outside, grateful for the roof above her and the warmth inside. But the shed's transformation didn't stop there. Inspired by the fresh start, Margaret started a small garden in front of the shed, growing tomatoes and herbs in painted tin cans. She found an old rocking chair at a yard sale and placed it on a small makeshift porch where she could sit with a cup of tea and watch the sun dip behind the trees. The little shed, once dark and desolate, had become a vibrant part of the landscape, a symbol of resilience and hope. As the months passed, Margaret found herself happier than she had been in years. She no longer thought of the shed as a last resort, but as a triumph. It wasn't the size of the rooms or the grandeur of the building that made it a home, but the love and care she had poured into every inch of it. Margaret's story became a testament to the power of resilience and creativity, a reminder that sometimes the smallest spaces can hold the most warmth. When you have a bit of vision and a lot of courage, even the unlikeliest places can become a true home. And now, looking at that little green shed with lights glowing softly in the dark, no one could ever call it just a shed again.